Jacqueline Marks. I'm the archivist at Amagansett Library, and I'm especially grateful to have an archaeologist, Alison McGovern, here today with us, because archaeology really is the linchpin of everything that archivists strive to discover and to preserve. We get it secondhand from the archaeologists who are actually gathering evidence from the earth. So there's nothing better than being able to listen to and learn from an archaeologist who's in the field and who has made the focus of her studies Long Island. So today she'll be sharing her latest on-site research on what Alison calls the forgotten and silenced past of Native American villages, slave and free Black communities, working class neighborhoods, and planned communities that existed alongside the better known estates, farms, and suburbs. It's a true pleasure to welcome Alison right now. And those of you who might have been here last month when the technology failed us, thank you for coming back. And I can't wait to hear what Alison is going to teach us.
Thank you, Jackie, for that introduction. And thank you, Connor, for both of you for inviting me here. I'm broadcasting today from the Southampton History Museum, which is very exciting. So my name is Alison McGovern, and I'm a professional archaeologist with a firm called Richard Grubb and Associates. Most of my work is in the New York area, particularly on Long Island, where I also live. And so today I'm going to be presenting some information from archaeological sites that I've explored. A lot of this research is also being presented in a forthcoming manuscript and a website, which is a virtual exhibit of certain archaeological sites I've worked on. And that was all compiled while I was a writing fellow at the Gotham Center for New York City History. So, so I'm really happy to be here today to speak with you all about my work as an archaeologist on Long Island. As I mentioned, I'm in the process of writing this manuscript, which is actually called Long Island Dirt. And it feels really ambitious, but it's a personal approach to understanding the many histories and pasts that make up this place called Long Island. It's a place that many of us call home, including me. And it's a place that is rich in diverse histories, peoples, and narratives. And for those of us who live here, we know what it means to have neighbors, to be a part of a community. And we know, even though we often can't define it, that our identities as Long Islanders are shaped by the region in which we live and how our communities are defined in relation to each other. So for those of us who live here, we're all familiar with these discussions of North Shore versus South Shore communities. We have Suffolk versus Nassau County, not to mention Brooklyn and Queens, which are geographically a part of Long Island, though some would argue that cultural aspects differentiate Brooklyn and Queens from Suffolk and Nassau counties. But really all of this is to say that Long Island identity is tied up within a series of boundaries and relationships that are not so easily understood from outsiders. And this interests me as an anthropologist and a historian. I'm really interested in how our understanding of the present can be informed by the past. So my goal for this project is to use archaeological data from particular locales or microhistories and build place-based narratives. Then I attempt to tie those place-based narratives into some big picture discussions of Long Island history, because I think this will also shed light on how we, as contemporary Long Islanders, relate to each other, to the island, and to the region. And so I have a map up here from 1863, which shows the towns and villages carved up as they were in 1863 before the creation of Nassau County. And so it sort of gives a sense of how municipal boundaries are developed and how communities relate within those municipal boundaries. Archaeology provides a method for us to understand lived experiences at the local or micro level. And historical archaeology in particular relies on multiple lines of evidence. So some of those sources or lines of evidence are illustrated here. In addition to recovering artifacts and features at sites, which really involves the digging with shovels and trowels, archaeologists also refer to historic maps to see if there's evidence of historic buildings or farmsteads. Sometimes those maps will have ownership or occupation illustrated with a structure, so we can take that information and consult the federal census data to get a sense of how many people lived in a place, what they did for work, and how they're identified by government officials. For more specific information regarding economics, we can look at things like account books or diaries that may be available in the special collection sections of our local libraries. And another very important, but often too overlooked resource is interviews and conversations with descendants and local residents. Basically, the various stakeholders who might have information about the people who lived at the site. So through the use of these different sources, we're able to investigate aspects of the past that might not be readily available through other historical accounts. We can examine things like economic strategies, labor strategies, and even different attributes of ethnicity, race, class, and gender. In particular, we could look at how people are identified by government officials versus how people who lived at a site self-identified. So some of the resources that I mentioned are illustrated here. On the upper left, there's a photo of me in the field at the East Hampton Historical Farm Museum, where I did a phase 1 archaeological survey. To the right of that photo is an image of the 1840 census, and I believe that's for the Brookhaven area. So I frequently rely on census data to be able to get a sense of putting people's names and and different features, matching them up with specific spaces and sites. Below the census, we have a picture of the 1873 Beers Atlas, again of the Brookhaven area. So I'm actually connecting those two resources, the census and the map in this slide. So we can see, I'm actually relating people who are living at the site but aren't documented on the map. They were renters, so the names don't match up. To the right, there's an image of an account book from the East Hampton Library's Long Island collection, and this is one of the Gardner account books. It's a page that references, I believe it's George Pharaoh and Stephen Pharaoh, who were living in Indian Fields at the time, and it accounts for their transactions with Gardner. And then the photo on the lower left is from a Mapping Memories of Freetown event that I was working on a couple of years ago in East Hampton, where we were collecting oral histories and relating them to sites in the East Hampton area. So these are all the types of resources that we as historical archaeologists rely on to tell a story about the past. Now, as I mentioned, I'm a professional archaeologist and I work for a cultural resources management firm. And what that means is that I work within within the bounds of regulatory review. Not all archaeological sites receive equal attention in terms of research. That's really important. But what people don't really recognize is that the bulk of archaeological research that's done in this country is actually done in cultural resources management for compliance purposes. And this is done as part of a series of environmental reviews. In fact, most archaeologists in the United States are employed in these positions as opposed to academic positions. And that's because archaeology is important for building a record of our country's history. Now, archaeology is done through phased work, beginning with a survey. And then if a survey identifies a site, then additional research may be done to document the significance of that site and if it's eligible for listing on the National Register. So lots of work gets done all the time, but most of this research gets buried in what's called the gray literature, which are reports that get read by agencies who are reviewing the environmental impacts of projects. So my main purpose is to highlight some of the research generated by contract archaeology and share it in this forthcoming book, Long Island Dirt, which connects history at archaeological sites with a more regional or macro approach to understanding Long Island's histories. So I chose the title Long Island Dirt because I thought it was a fun play on words. Obviously, as an archaeologist, I work in the dirt, or my kids would say I play in the dirt. I use a method that requires digging holes and trenches to recover artifacts that are preserved in dirt for hundreds of years or perhaps even thousands of years. And that's what you see here on the screen. On the left, there's some pieces of quartz flakes or debitage, which are really the residue during the manufacture of stone tools. And these were recovered in Setauket. On the right, I'm working at a site in Huntington called the Crippen House, which was an African-American home in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I'm recovering whiteware, which is a couple of hundred years old during this excavation. But I think it's also fun to think about what the word dirt means in different contexts. So dirt is sometimes used for talk or gossip, more generally for stories about people. So I like the idea that I'm also playing with this notion of narrative. And for those of you who are familiar with my work, you know that I like to challenge dominant narratives through archaeological research. I'm really interested in alternative ways of exploring the past and shedding light on the lives of people who have been marginalized in historical narratives. So in a way, you could say I'm generating new dirt on people. And this becomes evocative when you consider what archaeologists are actually exploring, which are people's trash deposits. We're working through trash deposits of past peoples in middens, which is a fancy word for a trash dump, or even privies, which is what you see pictured on the right, if we're lucky. And now think about this, if you think about your own household trash, it can really reveal some quite personal things about how we live our lives. So pictured here are some artifacts that were recovered from the Fowler House in East Hampton on the left, and you see them as they're caught in the screen while we're sifting dirt at the excavation site. So there's pieces of bottle glass, there's a red clay pipe stem, there's some buttons, ceramics, and cowrie shell in there. And on the right is a photo of an outhouse building. I don't know the status of the archaeological context of the outhouse, but that's located in Sag Harbor. And it would be a wonderful site to be able to explore. So today, I thought I would talk about a topic that might be of interest to both the patrons of the Southampton History Museum and the Amagansett Library, and that is whaling. So I'll be talking about whaling history and how historical archaeology can shed light on the lives and experiences of Long Island's whalers. The whaling industry has a long history, beginning with drift whaling and ending with an expansive industry reliant on deep sea ventures. The industry was impacted through those years by competition between nations, changing demands for energy sources, the desire for luxury goods, and trade regulations. All these factors resulted in highs and lows in profits. Now, whaling drew all types of men for employment at sea, but the involvement of Indigenous and African-American men in North American whaling was particularly conspicuous. So today, I'll be discussing the economic conditions of some of those men and women of Eastern Long Island whose lives were impacted by whaling through documentary resources and archaeological data. So these are two images that I borrowed from a publication by John Strong, who is an eminent historian who's worked on Native American histories on Long Island, but also recently wrote about whaling in Long Island indigenous whaling in the 17th century. And so I would highly encourage anybody who's interested in learning more about that period to look up his work, or you could reach out to me and I could direct you to some sources. So during the 17th century, settlers of East Hampton learned early on from Montaukett traditional knowledge of the value of whale products. In fact, the residents of Southampton who moved there to build the settlement were already familiar with the presence of whales that swam close to the shoreline. In the early years, the residents waited for drift whales to wash upon the shore. They were considered the rightful property of the town proprietors who divided shares accordingly. But by the 1660s, there was a growing demand among East Hampton residents for European consumer goods. And to obtain those goods, the East Hampton settlers increased their production of goods that were in demand in Europe. And it was at this time that residents of the East End turned to coastal whaling. Coastal whaling, which involved the use of small boats just off the coast to herd whales onto the shore, started in the 1660s. This economic change from a communal to a private for-profit enterprise really marks the interest of the European settlers to participate more effectively in the English mercantile economy. The whale design, as it's referred to in East Hampton town records, demanded not only the construction and use of small boats, but a cheap, willing source of labor. Although the white men of the town wanted to profit from whaling, they were unwilling to perform the labor themselves. They had learned from mining drift whales that it was arduous, dangerous, and nauseating work. The indigenous residents of the town, therefore, became useful to the white residents as a labor source. According to local history, indigenous people were highly desired participants in whaling ventures from the beginning because of their familiarity with whales. Early town records, including land deeds between the Montaukets and the white settlers, noted that the Montaukets maintained rights to whales that were beached or drifted near the shore. They were known to use parts recovered from beached whales, and local lore suggests that they had a long history of whale hunting in small boats off the coast. So indigenous men were an obvious labor source in whaling because they were familiar with these animals. But indigenous men and women also wanted commercial goods which were available through global markets, and whaling provided the means to acquire them. The 17th century East Hampton settlement profited quickly and substantially from coastal whaling, meeting demands for whaling products worldwide. They built try-works, which were large pots for processing whale oil and blubber, and they built warehouses for the preparation of raw goods at Northwest Harbor near Gardner's Bay. Whalebone and oil, horses, animal meats and hides, fur, cordwood, planking, turpentine, and other raw materials were traded from that port at Northwest Harbor, established in 1653, to Boston, Rhode Island, England, and the Caribbean. Commercial goods, including ceramics, glasswares, guns and ammunition, sewing tools, textiles, molasses, sugar, and rum were imported from Europe and the Caribbean. Offshore whalers from Southampton would travel to Northwest for access to the harbor. And in the earliest contracts with white whaling companies, indigenous laborers were provided with small boats, harpoons, and other equipment, and were promised half of all the right whales that were caught. Later on, the terms become more vague, and eventually indigenous laborers no longer receive half of the catch. Historians point out a level of coercion from the beginning that was designed to ensure indigenous participation. There's evidence of controlling the labor source to return season after season to the whale design in the use of liquor, debt, and indentured servitude. So what eventually develops is a system of credit called the lay system, which allowed indigenous men to purchase goods from local merchants and traders in exchange for their share or their lay or promise of the catch during the following whaling season. Yet whalers often came back empty-handed. By this system, the indigenous laborers were in a form of bondage or debt peonage to their creditors with little chance of ever paying off debt. The system guaranteed their labor season after season and kept indigenous whalers at the mercy of merchants and creditors who controlled the sale and pricing of consumer goods to debtors. The whaling season ran from December through April, and those men who worked for whaling companies were often employed during the remainder of the year in farm labor. So eventually, the whale population in coastal New York and southern New England was exhausted from overhunting. And when coastal whaling became less lucrative, those small boat whalers were replaced by schooners that eventually had to travel out farther from the coast and deeper into international waters in search of whales. Nantucket led the Northeast colonies in deep sea whaling from roughly 1712 to 1750. Whaling companies sent ships 40 or 50 miles offshore at first, but then around 1750, when try works were performed on deck, larger ships and bigger crews were sent out to deeper and deeper ocean waters. According to historian Catherine Grover, more than half of the Nantucket whaling crews between 1725 and 1734 were comprised of Native Americans from Long Island, Cape Cod, and Martha's Vineyard. So this late 18th century map pictured here illustrates the eastern end of Long Island in proximity to Nantucket. It's interesting because it provides a coastal perspective of how the region is connected. And it makes sense of the connections that developed between Montauk Indians who were settled at Indian Fields in Montauk and the other Southern New England indigenous and tribal peoples. So that's what you see here. On the left, you actually see, I don't know if I can get a pointer here, but this, the eastern tip of Long Island here, this is Montauk, and there was a settlement, Montauk settlement here. And we're showing this in relation to Southern New England and Nantucket. So we could see how closely people were connected across the Sound. So I think it's really interesting, this perspective, because it sort of resets how we think about Long Island today and how Long Island is situated in relation to New York City and Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And it sort of orients us to a more indigenous perspective of how people related to the region. And this is another map showing Long Island in relation to Southern New England. So it's important to recognize that indigenous connections existed on north and south of the Long Island Sound. We should really think about this as a cultural region that's characterized by shared linguistic patterns among tribal and indigenous groups, shared economic strategies. I mean, and there's even kin connections that have developed over thousands of years within this area. So to think about this is really orienting us in a more indigenous worldview. The Montauk settlement at Indian Fields is significant in light of these indigenous connections, but it's also significant in relation to Long Island indigenous labor in Nantucket whaling. So what you see here is an 1838 map of Montauk specifically. There's Great Pond in the middle here, and there was an indigenous Montauk settlement, tribal lands located here between Great Pond and what's described as Oyster Pond here on this map. And so people were living here for thousands of years up until about the 1880s. And there's strong connections between the people who lived here, the indigenous Montaukets who lived here, and Narragansetts, Mohegans, and other indigenous people on the other side of the Sound. So Indian Fields is located here in Montauk. And in the 1970s, several archaeological features within the Indian Fields settlement were investigated by archaeologists as a means of documenting those sites for the Suffolk County parks. So this archaeology was done a little bit before my time by archaeologists who worked and studied at Stony Brook University. But within the past 10 years, what I did was I revisited their research, their field notes and their artifacts to build up some contexts related to different households in the Indian Field site. When archaeologists were out there, they uncovered a total of 23 features, which included 5 house patterns, 3 middens, 7 storage features, 2 stone walls, and 6 additional unidentified features. All of these were investigated archaeologically to varying levels of intensity. And it's also not to say that they identified all resources that are preserved at the Indian Field site. But what they did learn is that there's archaeological evidence that the Montaukets became more firmly settled at Indian Fields around 1750, if not before, and remained there until the end of the 19th century, although their numbers did shrink as many people relocated from Montauk to other parts of Long Island or other parts of the country. Then eventually the Montaukets who were living at Indian Fields were dispossessed and relocated in the 1880s by Arthur Benson. But the history of Montaukett habitation within and around Indian Fields is really better remembered in indigenous tribal knowledge as a history of thousands of years of habitation. So this was the home to many Montaukett families, and today I want to briefly discuss the home of one Montaukett in particular, Jeremiah Pharaoh and his wife Alusa. Jeremiah Pharaoh was employed on many deep sea whaling ventures in the early part of the 19th century. Along with his wife and son, he's listed as a resident of Indian Fields on an 1806 census, which is one of the only enumerations that we have for the Montauketts at Indian Fields. But his memories of his voyages are actually recorded. They were recorded in a book that he acquired from Samson Occam, a minister that he knew through his activities in both Montauk and in Narragansett. And those memories indicate that he often spent years at sea as he ventured in and out of the port at Nantucket. So Pharaoh's home at Indian Fields was a small structure. If you're looking at this excavation map on the screen, you could see that there's a lot of archaeological features that are, they're all named A, and then they have Roman numerals after them. And that's a way for the archaeologists to identify each, to document all the features that they found. But the Pharaoh site, the Pharaoh household site, is on the lower left of the screen. It's identified as A2, and it's the shaded area just outside of a stone enclosure, okay? And that the wall of the stone enclosure is also built into the structure of Pharaoh's house there. So his home was small. It measured roughly 14 by 14 feet in size, and it was partly constructed of unmortared fieldstones. Only 2 walls were recovered, and a few displaced fieldstones mark a possible third wall. The south wall of the structure was constructed by incorporating that stone fence wall that extended from the corner of a larger fieldstone enclosure. Pharaoh's house is constructed in a blend of indigenous and European styles. And we actually, the archaeologists recorded a dense living surface inside the structure, which included faunal and fishbone mixed in with crushed shell and various artifacts found on the interior of the floor. Animal skins and reed mats would have lined the floor or served as raised bedding within this small structure. So here are some photographs from the 1970s excavation. On the left is a south view of the Jeremiah Pharaoh house, and you can see how some of the stones are built into that the slope of the ground. The south wall of the structure is built as part of that wall enclosure. And on the right, we have another view of the same structure showing the fieldstone layout from a different angle. And it was actually from this site that Jeremiah Pharaoh's scrimshaw knife handle was recovered. And so imagine this scrimshaw handle being carved on a long whaling journey. It's photographed here on both sides. It's kind of hard to see, but on the left side, he carved his name Jeremiah into it. And on the right side is Pharaoh, his last name. So as I mentioned, Nantucket was the leading port in offshore whaling in the mid-18th century. Indigenous autonomy and power are demonstrated in Nantucket account books from the second quarter of the 18th century, when they earned 4 times the salary of Boston seamen. Now, it's perhaps this history of indigenous employment in Nantucket whaling, along with the ability of indigenous laborers to negotiate higher salaries. Maybe these are some of the reasons that Montaukett men like Jeremiah Pharaoh, who lived in Montauk at Indian Fields, chose to sail out of Nantucket instead of one of the eastern Long Island ports. At this time, whaling ships were traveling deeper into the ocean because shore whaling had exhausted the local whale populations. And Nantucket really flourished because deep sea ventures could easily launch from that island. Although Nantucket whaling suffered during the American Revolution, around 1790, whaling picked up again and continued to flourish until the eve of the War of 1812. And this was the period when Pharaoh actually sailed out of Nantucket. It was there at Nantucket in 1794 that Pharaoh married his wife, Alusa Tolman. Their son, also named Jeremiah, was born in 1802, but according to Jeremiah's memories that were recorded in that law book, their son died only 6 years later. And the 1806 census actually places their home at Indian Fields, and the archaeological site of the household provides tangible evidence to corroborate this timing. Now, the material deposits suggest that the house was lived in from the late 18th into the early part of the 19th century, even while Pharaoh was away at sea. But the dynamics of household composition raise really important questions about labor, specifically concerning Alusa Tolman, or Alusa Tolman Pharaoh, and how she maintained the household when her husband was away at sea for years at a time. So at this site, about 5,000 artifacts were recovered, in addition to about 5,000 pieces of bone, also shell, organic materials, all recovered from inside and outside of the house. Archaeologists identified an open hearth inside the small structure near the south wall, and the remains of medium-sized mammals, shell, fish, and turtle bones were recovered from both within and outside the structure. These faunal and shell materials suggest that that the Pharaoh family who lived there. Sorry, I'm just lost my place. That the Pharaoh family that lived there ate a diet of mostly marine foods, including freshwater and saltwater fish, oysters and clams, and even turtle, with some evidence for larger land-based animals and birds. The remains of pig, cow, sheep, and some deer were recovered in small quantities at the site, along with a few turkey, duck, and possibly gull bones. There were cattle and sheep grazing at and around Indian Fields, which is where all of the townspeople from East Hampton had their cattle and sheep graze. And Jeremiah owned a cow or a sheep of his own. But we also know that in 1813, he profited by having a white East Hamptoner's cattle graze on his share of land at Indian Fields. Yet his family subsisted largely on locally gathered foods. Okay, we also find that the presence of gun flints, lead shot, and gun barrel fragments indicate that guns were used in hunting deer, turkey, and duck. Shellfish was gathered from local tidal pools, and fishing took place in fresh and salt water. All of these foods were part of a Long Island diet, whether Native American, African American, or European American, but the high percentage of turtle and fish are notable and indicate autonomy, as opposed to a dependence on the local market for feeding the household. So as I mentioned, there were plenty of mammal and bird bones recovered at the site, and some of those were worked into different items or artifacts that were recovered. So what you see here is a bird bone that was carved into a tube that may have been used for duck calling. Two additional bird bones have notches carved out, suggesting that they may have been attempts at making items similar to this. We also have several items made out of bone, like needles for basket making, button backs pictured here, and handles for tools. There's also ground and flaked stone artifacts found at the site, like this pestle that was recovered, which would be used for grinding of foods. Here's some more artifacts recovered from the site. Metal buttons and buckles. There's metal straight pins pictured at the top. There's also metal dining utensils, ceramics, glass bottles, glass bottle fragments, chimney glass, and even a painted glass tumbler, which I'll show in a minute. And these are among the many market items that were recovered from the archaeological record. In fact, there's a really interesting variety of refined earthenware ceramics from the 18th century, including the remains of 3 plates, 2 teapots, a Staffordshire slipware platter, and a pitcher, and 2 redware platters. There's lots of pearlware vessels, vases and pitchers, and an English stoneware mug. These are all in fragments, of course. and even fragments of a Rhenish blue and gray jug. As I mentioned, bone and metal tools were encountered. There were also beads, needles, and straight pins recovered from inside and outside the structure. But a greater frequency of these items came from inside the dwelling. And these types of items enter the archaeological record through loss, as things like buttons fall from their clothing. But these items in particular also represent sewing and perhaps household level production. And that's because of the types of items that were recovered and the quantities of sewing related items that were recovered. The bone buttons and single hole button blanks, which you see here, are also called button backs. These may have been manufactured on site. These items, along with 44 pieces of bone needles, a metal crochet hook, and a metal and bone awl, demonstrate household level craft production that might actually be attributed to Alusa, perhaps when her husband was away at sea. And so these activities the results of these activities may have been sold itinerantly, bringing in additional money into the house in her husband's absence, or she may have offered the service of sewing, mending, and washing clothes. So it's really interesting to think about how some of the artifacts here are related to a woman's work while her man is away at sea for, sometimes years at a time. So some of the residents in Indian Fields worked for John Lyon Gardner, and this was a page of the account book that I showed earlier. Presumably they worked at Gardner's Island. Pictured here on this account book, we see George Pharaoh, who also lived at Indian Fields. He obtained potatoes, corn, pork, salt, and sundries from Gardner and paid for them with locally caught bluefish and bushels of oysters. Stephen Pharaoh, his wife, his daughter, and possibly his sons all pulled flax, bottomed chairs, and exchanged bushels of oysters for pork, corn, wheat, and an old skiff. Between 1760 and 1845, the economic exchanges of at least 11 residents of Indian Fields were recorded among many transactions in the account books of John Lyon Gardner, like the one you see here, Abraham Talmadge, and Gardner and Parsons, Nathaniel Hand, and even Isaac Van Scoy. So those account books I reviewed all of those at the East Hampton Library, Long Island collection. But these transactions indicate that men and women apparently worked equally hard to maintain their households, obtain consumer goods, and bring food to the table. So in Jeremiah's absence, it might have been Alusa who was fishing, gathering oysters, bottoming chairs, and making baskets in exchange for corn, wheat, potatoes, pork, and even molasses. Yet Jeremiah and Alusa are not listed among the exchanges in the account books from 1760 to 1845. Now, certainly Jeremiah and Alusa must have been active in the same local networks as the other residents of Indian Fields, but they may also have participated in networks that extended beyond the town of East Hampton. We know that Jeremiah's labor at sea would have led him to other points of exchange along the Atlantic seaboard. And we also know from some of the writings of Samson Occam that Jeremiah Pharaoh and Alusa Talmud were part of an extended a network of indigenous people in the southern New England area tied to the New Light religious movement. So there's lots of opportunities for Jeremiah to acquire market goods outside of East Hampton. And in the same vein, visitors to Montauk, which would include both white and indigenous missionaries, may have also brought items for exchange with them. And so it's external trade networks that might explain the presence of this ceramic tumbler. It's a polychrome enameled blown glass mug that was recovered at the site at the Pharaoh household. And this item was manufactured in Europe between 1775 and 1825. And according to my experience in archaeology, it's not an artifact that's found frequently on archaeological sites on Long Island. It's definitely unique. It was it was unfamiliar to most of the Long Island historical archaeological collections, and it was not quite common to some of the historical societies that I had reached out to research at the time. So it prompted me to really think about what sorts of activities, local and global activities, could really account for its presence. And in the process of researching comparable archaeological sites, I found that another site on Long Island, about 14 miles west of Indian Fields, near the 3 Mile Harbor area, mentions a similar type of object at a site that dates to about the same time period. And it's not a site that I worked on, so I had to comb through the gray literature, or the archaeology reports from Cultural Resources Management to find another reference for something similar to this. And the presence of this artifact in similar sites suggests that the sites were inhabited by similar people of similar backgrounds. And it prompted me to think about how these sites might have been, the people who lived there might have been engaged in similar activities or even parts of similar networks. As I mentioned, Pharaoh traveled, and he recorded some of his notes of his travels in a prayer book, or actually, I think it was either a prayer book or a law book that he acquired through his friendship with Samson Occam. And so some of the quotes are posted here, where March the 3rd, I arrived at Montauk in the year of our Lord, 1798, on Saturday night. I was gone 9 years and 5 months. I sailed out Nantucket. Or I, Jeremiah Pharaoh, the bold mariner, I sailed the world all over 9 long years. When I returned home, I found my relations stranded, which grieved my heart full so. And so he returns to Montauk at a time when many Montauks had already had left and moved on with Samson Occam to form new settlements called the Brothertown Settlement, first in Oneida, New York. So this household was occupied for probably less than a 30-year period. And that's based on the dating of some of the artifacts that are recovered at the site. We know that only one child was documented during that time, and he died at 6 years old. And we have no information available to indicate that the house was passed to other children or relatives. And it's not known when or if Jeremiah and Elusa ever left Indian Fields. But the people who made up this house made up a small family whose lifeways probably challenged outsiders' expectations of Indianness. And that also has a lot to do with their participation in whaling. And what you can see here is how a small family can develop strategies to maintain a household while the husband is working at sea and the wife is taking care of resources in his absence. So this hand-painted glass tumbler is really a material reminder of how artifacts can encourage network thinking. They can connect a local site to regional and global economic activities. And that network thinking really allows us to consider the movement of material culture, but allows us to think about how the interactions of people are reflected through these different items. We could think about where people met, right? In what different labor networks, in kin networks, in consumer networks, or in neighborhoods. And we think about what happens when people meet, and form new relationships, or reinforce existing ones. Through archaeology, we sometimes encounter exotic items like this that we would actually expect to be curated rather than lost or discarded, and becoming part of the archaeological record. But somehow, surprisingly, they end up in the archaeological record. We see this with the items at the Pharaoh house at Indian Fields, but we also see it at the Pyrrhus Concer site in the village of Southampton, where this artifact on the right was recovered. This bamboo calligraphy brush was recovered during archaeological investigations there. And now, for those of you who are familiar with the Southampton village area, you're probably familiar with Pyrrhus Concer and his site on Agawam Lake. Pyrrhus Concer was born to, and we're changing gears in terms of time period here. But Pyrrhus Concer was born to an enslaved mother during the gradual emancipation era in New York State. and glimpses of his life are captured in documents that mention his work, his travel, his economic transactions, and even community contributions. Concer is locally remembered as a freed slave, a whaleman, an African-American entrepreneur, and a respected community member. And so his work and his presence are really important to the historic fabric of Long Island history. Now, his property, which is, as I mentioned, in Southampton Village on Agawam Lake. I'm sorry, I should have shown you the picture. Pyrrhus Concer. Here he is. If you look at the map on the right, it's Southampton Village, and down at the bottom you see Town Pond, which is Agawam Lake. And just to the left of Town Pond, you see two structures here. One is Concer's home, and one is one of his relatives' homes. I think it's P. Concer and P. Williams for Prince Williams. This map dates to 1873, but his property was owned at a much earlier point. And in fact, Concer's property is among the earliest documented as free Black land ownership in Southampton town. As early as 1820, Concer's grandparents were settled there and owned the property before him. And it was not until 1838 that Concer purchased 1 acre from his grandparents, who owned a 4-acre parcel west of Agawam Lake that is referred to as Gad's Lot in some of the historic deeds. In an 1838 deed, Pyrrhus Concer is actually identified as Pyrrhus Gad, and he purchased property from his grandparents, Gad and Esther Prince. Concer's grandparents were enslaved. His parents were enslaved, and they were all captives of Nathaniel Cooper. And Concer's grandfather was apparently also a whaler. Gad and Esther's manumission is documented in the Southampton town records as conditional, provided that Gad completed a whaling venture, which Captain William Fowler would lead. At some point between 1811 and 1838, Gad and Esther became owners of the 4 lots west of Agawam Lake. And so it's interesting, it's possible that the acquisition of this land is directly related to his experience whaling. So whaling was a familiar labor opportunity in Concer's family, and perhaps that's why Pyrrhus Concer also pursued whaling at least once. But by the time Concer went whaling, the whaling venture was already on the decline, and other sources of fuel were in ready supply. This paintbrush or calligraphy brush shown on the left appears to have been made out of bamboo, and it was recovered during archaeological investigations at the Concer site, which took place in 2016. It's really an incredibly rare and unique find that reminds us of Concer's travels at sea. And he was remembered on the ship, the Manhattan, that famously ended up in Japan. The whaling ship launched out of Sag Harbor, captained by Mercator Cooper, and headed for the northwest coast. And on this voyage, the crew encountered some stranded Japanese sailors and returned them to Tokyo Bay. At that time, Japan was closed to Americans, but the voyage was a big deal, and there's historic documentation for the visit, like this Japanese scroll that depicts Mercator Cooper and 2 of his crew. And so one of those individuals is probably Pyrrhus Concer. This Japanese scroll is part of the collections of the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And so it's really important in connection with this, bamboo brush that was recovered at Concer's site, because it really reveals some interesting information tied to this particular whaling venture, where people, ended up in Japan, and gifts were exchanged as a thank you for returning the stranded Japanese soldiers to Tokyo Bay. So many historians point out that debt, coercion, and indentured servitude were frequent conditions of indigenous whaling, but others point out that some whalers, particularly those who are indigenous or of African-American backgrounds, had degrees of autonomy in negotiating the terms of their employment. And these disagreements in whether or not people faced debt or not seem to reflect the highs and the lows of the industry. International markets for whale oil, baleen, and other products were impacted by various factors like competition within the industry and even by wars. So sometimes whaling was profitable and sometimes whalers suffered from competition, trade embargoes, and war. Or perhaps it may be that some people benefited more from whaling than others. According to historian W. Jeffrey Bolster, the whaling shares were skewed to benefit ship owners. While many whalemen of color aspired to buying land and homes, many rented because of the irregular income from seafaring, and still others frequented boarding houses. But regardless of those market forces, whaling was challenging work. It was arduous, it was messy, it was often tedious at times. And in order to entice men to join whaling crews, companies offered shares of the profit. The more successful a whaling voyage, the higher the share received by crewmen. Men were often outfitted for whaling voyages based on credit from their return share, and wives and daughters were also permitted to purchase goods from local merchants using credit from the whalers' shares. In short, whaling provided opportunities for property ownership, which is evident in histories at the Pyrrhus Concer site. It's evident in some histories in Freetown and in the Eastville neighborhood of Sag Harbor, where people of color settled during and after whaling voyages. And whaling also has implications for understanding a division of labor within households. And this we see at the Pharaoh household site in Montauk, where we can clearly see a division of labor based on gender, where men and women are both participating in households. And finally, whaling presented an opportunity for men to see the world, encounter new people, and acquire exotic goods. So by participating in global travel and trade, Indigenous and African-American men experienced a more cosmopolitan experience than those who remained behind. And that brings us to the end of my presentation. So I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about how archaeology can shed light on the lived experiences of whalers and their families. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. This was a super great talk, a lot of amazing information. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to submit them in either the chat function or the Q&A function here on Zoom, and I will go through now and see what we have. We have one question here. Where did the stones for Pharaoh's house come from?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And I don't think I can answer that question. There's definitely rocky till out in Montauk, so it's possible that they are local stones as opposed to ballast brought across in ships. But I guess I can't really answer that question.
Yeah, that's the thing with archaeology. I mean, I feel like you get to the bottom of a lot of questions, but there's always pieces that end up sort of in the mix where you can never really be certain.
Yep.
If anybody else has any questions, please feel free to submit them. I'll say I was definitely really interested to hear the last little bits about Pyrrhus Concer and sort of the history that you were able to talk about there, because I worked personally with Brenda Simmons, the director of the African American Museum, a lot on compiling research and information about Pyrrhus Concer, and yeah, his story is really interesting, and I would love to hear more about anything that's been found over there and any connections you've been able to make from it.
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, I'd be willing to present again on the archaeology at that site. Yeah, and I'm sorry that his part was so short in relation to the Indian Field site, but there's just a lot more archaeological information related to the Indian Field site than the Concer site because of the limitations within the type of archaeology that we did at that site. So. Yeah. But still, even with the limitations, we found some really spectacular items. I mean, you don't really expect to find a bamboo calligraphy brush preserved in the dirt. So
yeah, I've given talks on Pyrrhus before, and just his story alone can take up an hour or two. So yes, mixing in anything with the archaeological finds would be really fascinating to hear one of these days. We have another question. They were asking if a link will be posted to watch this again, and yes, there will be. So we recorded this Zoom talk, and it's going to be live on our YouTube page within the next 2 weeks. So when that's done, I'll be sure to email it to everybody who signed up to today and anybody on our mailing list. And I'll also send it over to Jackie at the Amagansett Free Library, and they'll be sending it out hopefully as well. So it'll definitely get out there for everybody to check out in the future.
Connor, I'm not sure how to turn my video back on, but I have a question for Allison.
Oh, sure.
And a comment. So my question is, would you be able to share the site where you got the first map? That, well, all the maps were of great interest to me.
Mhm.
And I'm a big reader of John Strong's work, and I have read his book. I do recommend it along with Allison, his book about the whalers of color. It pertains to Amagansett as well, because we have a rich history in offshore whaling and shore whaling, mostly shore whaling. But the maps are of great interest to me, because that is how I tried to convey our history, the history of Amagansett, because we're closely linked to the Montaukets.
Well,
So-
yeah, so why don't I can share with you those maps. I can share direct links for where to get them, because they're all digital, you know.
Okay, that would be
so-
great. That would
yeah.
be really helpful, because Amagansett was the place for going on to Montauk and coming off of Montauk. And
Yeah.
so there was a lot of exchange here between the native population and the proprietors of East Hampton and the people who settled further east, which this was considered at the time.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you. It was an invaluable talk. And I also remember seeing one of those scrolls at the Sag Harbor Historical Society, and I wasn't sure how it got there. Now you've given me an idea of how it might have come to be there. It might have been from a whaling voyage.
Yeah.
From that same whaling voyage, perhaps.
Oh, wow. So I didn't know that Sag Harbor had any of those.
One I remember is there in their archives. And
Okay.
I'd be happy for you to investigate that.
I'm definitely going to.
Let's see, in the questions, we had somebody else providing a little information, saying that the outhouse in Sag Harbor was owned by Liz Bozer. Sorry for mispronunciation, potentially. She told me that there was a well beneath the kitchen floor, which is interesting. And then also that in Sag Harbor, they have retrieved a number of bone handles similar to the ones in your discovery. Which also, I think in our collection here at the Southampton History Museum, we've come across a few things like that, where at the Halsey House, we removed a tree, went back when I was an intern about 6 years ago. And in the roots of the tree was all this archaeological material, because it was where the outhouse used to be. And so one of my jobs as an intern was pulling out all the bottles and plate particles and bone fragments and organizing them. And we have those all organized in our collection. So I would love to show you those one day if you haven't had a chance to see them.
Yeah, definitely. I actually, I was invited to that to see that when it happened. And I can't remember who I met out here.
It's probably our old curator, Emma, when she was working
Yes,
here.
it was Emma. Yeah. Because there was some hope that some archaeology could be done with it. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't see any other questions in here right now, but I want to thank you again, Allison, for doing this talk. It was fantastic. A lot of great information, and archaeology is one of those things where it's so important, and it's such like a hard job to really do. And it makes a lot of our jobs so much easier, where I can just have all that great information from you to be able to put on these exhibits and do research. So it's really vital to keeping history alive.
Well, thank you. And I thank you so much for having me twice. And I also want to share with your patrons my online exhibit, Long Island Dirt. So I'll send you, Connor and Jackie, I'll send you a direct link to that. So hopefully you can share it with your, with your patrons. And it provides more information for some of the other sites that I didn't get to talk about today. But, they are also exhibited virtually. So
it's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Hope you have a great rest of your days.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Connor.